This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. On this episode, Edwidge Danticat joins me to discuss her essay collection, We're Alone. No spoilers, but the last sentence from the last essay in Edwidge Danticat's collection, We're Alone, is, "Our journey continues." Just before this conclusion of the essay, she has just recounted an anecdote involving her mother where she says, "I was lost. They found me. The journey continued." The context of loss is important here too, as it works in tandem with the idea of the necessity for the journey to continue. These are the hallmarks of the essays Danticat offers here. Wide-ranging subjects include everything from her childhood in Haiti, her adolescence as a new immigrant to the United States, the COVID-19 pandemic, and recent events in Haiti. These are personal essays, reportage, literary analysis, and tributes to her mentors and to her heroes, including Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Danticat shares personal stories that expand and connect to the rest of us. We can perceive the world's vexing problems by way of her own stories and her generous way of looking at the world and always considering community as much as she considers herself. Literature is a constant saving grace for her. It guides her through tragedies and triumphs, through stories about environmental catastrophe, the traumas of colonialism, motherhood, and the complexities of resilience that she helps us understand. I spoke to Edwidge Danticat about her essay collection, We're Alone. I'll start with the title of the book. It's We're Alone. And I appreciate that the title is something malleable, like it's not just one thing. And I wondered what kind of a guiding principle this is, maybe. But for me as a reader, it's a shape-shifting thing as I read. So I wonder if you can talk about the title.
Well, I think, we know so many versions of this expression, right? We're alone. And even, for me and in Haitian Creole, it's nous pour compte nous. It's also a kind of paradoxical in our language. But what I was thinking about with this title, of course, especially these days, right, in very challenging times, we all wonder, are we alone, or do we have allies, or are there people around us who to help us, giving rise to that expression, no one's coming to save us. But I was also thinking of it in terms of reading, because I've been a passionate reader my whole life, and I've always found so much comfort in the pages of books. So I was also thinking about it in the way that readers and writers are alone together.
I love this idea, and it reminds me of something from the essay, They Are Waiting in the Hills, in this collection, that shows that this idea about reading also. You write about the writers that you admire as you reflect on your own writing. Writers like Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The other thing about the essays here is there's a braided quality to them, that they're not just about one thing, and we see these interesting transitions to other ideas. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit first about your reading life, and then maybe we can talk about some of those other intersections.
My reading life started, when I was 4. My uncle got me a small book. It's like this Madeline books. And I went to school very early when I was a kid, and it wasn't always, fun. But one thing I picked up on was the reading. And I grew up with storytellers who are very vibrant and, use their bodies to tell stories. But when I read a book, I was shy. And when I sat with a book, I felt like that story was just for me. So that's often the relationship I have with writers who I read, including the writers who are listed in They're Waiting in the Hills. So that connection with them and with a story is part of, now my daily reading life has a lot to do. I read a lot for my students for class. But often the writers like Marquez and Toni Morrison and others that I've also talked about in my previous essay collection, Create Dangerously. All of those writers are part of my current and past reading life, and I go back to them. I think that's the distinct, and that's why I think of them as waiting in the hills, even those, especially those who have passed on. They're always there on the page for me, which is how the book opens with the Haitian poet who I just came across a few words and just followed down this track that in part led to some of the queries in the book.
I love this idea about what the essay allows for in talking about a favorite writer or what they meant to your reading life, but so many other things. For instance, we see in there, Waiting in the Hills, the ways in which you use your observations about Haiti to discuss the experience of the diaspora. What is it that writing essays specifically allows you to do as a writer, different from the other genres?
Yes, I mean, I'm in the middle of writing an essay right now about the past experiences of Haitians on Guantanamo, even as Guantanamo is being considered currently as a detention center, right? And so looking back on the past uses of it. So writing essays for me is a way of figuring out what I'm thinking about something. The origin of the word essay is from the French essayer, to try. So it doesn't, for me, it doesn't really mean that you've landed specifically somewhere, like that you have, declarations to make from a top of a mountain, but that you're working your way through something. And what you mentioned earlier about the braided essay, I feel like that's my favorite kind of essay, where you're seeing the writer work through a form or trying to get to a thought, and you're going on a journey together. And those are actually the two premises of these essays for me. One is what I talk about in the preface, borrowing from the anthropologist Gina Tinarilis, this idea of rassemblage, reassembly, and also this idea of the essay as a body of water, and that you sort of follow through. So the essay for me has more urgency than fiction. It feels like it often feels when I'm writing an essay, that it needed to be out there like yesterday. And the way that when I engage in fiction, I know it will take a while. I know it will take some time to create people. The essay is the first line of defense for me.
It's almost when we write essays like we don't even really know where we're going. We're building the rope as we go, as we pull ourselves through somehow, it feels like.
Absolutely. We're going on a journey, and it's kind of amazing when you working your way through and all the strands that you pull together. I guess going back to this metaphor of braiding, certainly that's one of the things I really enjoy about writing the essay. This element of discovery as you go.
Yeah, it can be a hard sell. You mentioned your students. I think it can be a hard sell sometimes when we say this. I think people want to know exactly where they're going with it, but to essay or to craft an essay is really just to try to have a sense of an idea of a subject, but then all bets are off. You could end up in a totally different place with it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the essays in this book are like that. I tell people, I try to give folks like a guide of the way through. I'm like, don't worry, we'll get stuff. Eventually we'll land this plane.
Yeah, but that's one of the things I love. And This Is My Body, for example. This happens in a very interesting way. And I think this is what the essay can do best. We begin with your experience of being in a mall, trapped really in what turns out to be not a mass shooting, but a hoax of a mass shooting. But then the essay covers other things beyond gun violence and how these things impact society, maybe lamentably the way mass shootings do. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this essay. It is a braid of gun violence in our country, but also of other things.
Oh yes. I mean, it so happened like a day or so before Christmas. I happened to be in a mall where I thought I was in a mass shooting, and I was, and still to this day, I'm really struck sometimes by how much that affected me.
Yeah.
because it turned out not to be a mass shooting, but the body sometimes is imprinted by certain experiences, whether they're simulated or not. So it was some kids who had put, the sounds of gunfire over their loudspeaker somehow. But everything, like, just suddenly it felt like I was in something I had been seeing in the news all the time. And so that also, I had a stretch of time where I was sitting behind a hedge and kind of reviewing certain parts of my life, if you will. And that essay, I wanted to have the reader also experience that feeling of just thinking about all the ways in which our bodies are vulnerable, our, like, sort of life can change on a dime. And so I just started thinking about all these other ways, all these other people, all the things that I heard of been through or experienced or heard other people go through, in which they suddenly had no control over their bodies, right? Suddenly their bodies was turned over to violence in a way that they couldn't control. And other people, like, who had made efforts to try to understand that by subjecting their bodies to the same way. So it started in an essay in a way about vulnerable bodies, and ended in this space where to just examine all these other ways that our bodies become vulnerable, or like, and how that can change so quickly.
It's just so fascinating how you do lend the plane, how we just trust and follow and keep reading the essay and learn more beyond, or can think about more beyond the initial subject that we walk into when we first start reading the essay. This is something in Writing the Self and Others, another essay. You are exploring writing, the act of writing about your own experiences as a Haitian immigrant, and then you consider the points of views and the stories of others. And it's about how you are navigating your own identity, and then how storytelling becomes this powerful thing that allows us to communicate about ourselves, but then also to tell the stories of others, you as a writer, to avoid like the trap of solipsism, or, that can emerge so easily in nonfiction. But this is really about another thing. It's like this intersectionality that's so interesting. I think about how we are currently as a country under fire just in terms of the idea of intersectionality, of elevating the stories of others. I wonder if you've thought about this lately, how your book, We're Alone, is in this space in March of 2025, where the responsibility of the writer in presenting their own story, but also the stories of others, is for me more important than ever, but also something that is subject to a kind of an erasure or a silencing.
I think, especially in recent weeks, I've been thinking so much about this essay that Toni Morrison published in The Nation in a different time, similarly to this one, where she said, well, this is the time when artists go to work. The essay starts with her describing how she was depressed and feeling disheartened, and about, the political situation in the country. And then a friend of hers told her, well, this is when artists go to work. And I think a lot of us, just as human beings, as, as citizens, will probably likely find ourselves facing very difficult situations in which we're tested, in which we have to possibly stand up for a neighbor, for a friend. So this idea of defining what our work means, of course, it will certainly mean standing in for other people generally, and telling stories, telling underrepresented stories is part of that. I think, for example, in the fall before the elections, when it was all over the news that, people were being told as part of an election campaign that people from Haiti eat cats and dogs, like they're in danger of eating your pets, and terrible things being told about you purposely. They were told to purposely shape a narrative. And that was the time for people to go to work, and then to try to tell a counter narrative, or the correct, to try to correct lies. And so I think, the work of storytellers in general is more complicated. I find, at the same time, I find myself comforted when I'm in the, like, I'm at I could be at a poetry reading and feel myself wanting to cry because it contrasts to the news, right? To the constant vitriol. So I think storytelling is more important than ever, truth telling. And this is why I keep going back to these writers, especially to Toni Morrison, highlighting like this is when we go to work, whatever our work is. This is the time more than ever to do it, especially as a way of where so many of us are being dehumanized. If you're an immigrant, if you're an undocumented immigrant, this is the work, the stories we tell are part of, like, as my mom would say, of putting the flesh back in our bones.
I think about all the ways that Haitian immigrants, as you describe, are presented in such ways, in such distorted ways. And people don't really understand, I think, what Haitians go through in Haiti. And in A Rainbow in the Sky, this is an essay where you're talking about the effects of hurricanes on Haiti, the toll on people who live there, this vulnerability, this hardship faced by communities that are struggling with poverty and all of this instability. Then there is a rainbow, which typically symbolizes a glimmer of hope in a storm or after a storm. There is a resilience that you assign to this place and the people. And in 2025, I think about even here where I am in Texas, the way that Haitian immigrants can be perceived. And, it was all over the news, this very stark image of Border Patrol on the horse and the Haitian immigrant. So I think about the idea of the Haitian immigrant a lot here in Texas, because there is a kind of a different perception that I think that comes from a certain level of ignorance. I think sometimes people don't really understand what is happening in the home countries of people who make the difficult decision to leave everything that they know. But in A Rainbow in the Sky, there's something there that I see, this idea of resilience, I think, that I feel like you were treating in that particular essay. I wonder if you can talk about that.
And it's interesting that essay talks about TPS, and in the beginning of the essay, there's a very massive hurricane in Haiti in 2016, and in the following year, there's a call to renew temporary protected status for Haitians, which has just been revoked for 600,000 Venezuelans and 500,000 Haitians, which makes them deportable, in August. And so we were at a demonstration, to ask for renewal of TPS when this rainbow emerged in the sky. And at the same time, a friend had told me that they had also seen a rainbow during the hurricane. And I wanted to use these elements of nature, nurturing, positive, and a rainbow has very different meaning in very different cultures, but we generally see it as a good sign because it's so pretty. And then to also talk about weather and what's driving immigration and the demand for things like TPS in the first place, right? It certainly goes back, as you mentioned, to the root causes of migration. And more just nature itself is becoming the root cause of migration and driving people to borders where more and more being mistreated and less welcomed. So the people who were being whipped on the horses are now considered conquering heroes by this administration, for example, right? So these fates can change so much in how we perceive the neighbor or people seeking asylum. And that's certainly, I talked about Guantanamo before, where the first people detained on Guantanamo were Haitian and Cuban asylum seekers. So we see a cycle of more and more of people seeking shelter as being labeled undesirables, and which is worth paying very close attention to because the definitions shift so quickly, whether either you're Haitian in the Dominican Republic or you're a Haitian here, where you see like these kind of narratives about being Haitian converging and what that means for not just people who are Haitian who are seeking asylum, but people who want to keep them out or people who want to stigmatize them have been given a playbook, to that can be used on others. Just as we saw like Haitian detention being a kind of model for then what followed, with terrorism suspects afterwards on Guantanamo, and what's being offered up again. So there's sometimes people think, oh, this doesn't concern me, and I think a lot of people in the election say, oh no, people like me will not be deported, or people like me would not be in danger. But you kind of have to follow the clues and how people are. If one group of people can be dehumanized and stigmatized and othered in such a brutal way, others can be. But one thing, you've talked about resilience. I think I link that with hope. You have no choice. That's part of the work, right? We have to keep working. We have to hope, because there's our generations behind us that went through a lot also, and some of it worse. And there's a generation ahead that looks to us.
Edwidge, I wonder if in closing, if you can close a kind of circle for me about the title of We're Alone. You mentioned the paradoxical sense of it too. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yes. The book was coming together slowly actually during the pandemic, where we all felt kind of alone. And one thing I realized, and even that moment, we weren't fully alone, And in life, we're never fully alone. When I first bring up this title, people say, will say, yes, we're alone sometimes, but we're not always alone. Our ancestors are always with us. The people who sacrificed so much for us to be alive are always with us in spirit. But we're also alone together when we gather, when we're in community. Even if it's an ostracized community, we are alone. We share even those designations with other people. So I like to think of aloneness as not the opposite of community, but complementary to community, where even when others would want to ostracize us or otherize us or humiliate us, at least we're alone together.
Edwidge Danticat, what a thrill and what an honor. Thank you for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Edwidge Danticat is the author of We're Alone. It's published by Grey Wolf Press. We're Alone is a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music, and Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.